All right, Thomas Wayne Riley. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Great. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. The It seems as if spring is finally here in the American South. It is absolutely beautiful, and so of course, what am I doing on a beautiful sunny morning? I'm hunched over my computer, right?
Yep.
But I'm glad to be speaking to you, man. So obviously, I know you, I know your work, but my audience might not. So who are you, and what do you do?
Well, yeah, I'm Thomas Wayne Riley, the American Southwest. I have a show, little history podcast, and I also have a website that highlights the American Southwest. I talk about things that interest me. My most recent series was over the Civil War in the American Southwest because very few know that there were some major campaigns out here, which is exciting since I'm from Georgia. So I have an affinity for the Civil War.
That makes sense. I didn't know you were from Georgia, but I can hear it in how you speak. And I was about to ask you, like, what accent is that? And the little tint of Georgia, that makes sense. Uh, so yeah, I am a complete and total amateur when it comes to American history. I'm a firm believer in the division of labor, and I have a great number of friends who are much smarter than I am when it comes to American history. But I actually don't know very much about the Civil War in the Southwest. Now, obviously, I'm not asking you to give a treatise on it, but could you give the kind of broad strokes of that?
Oh, absolutely. So there were, for a couple decades, Texas and Texans really wanted New Mexico. They tried a couple times, they ended disastrously one time and kind of ended in the Compromise of 1850 the other time. And so once the Civil War broke out, Texans under Baylor pretty much stormed, and the Knights of the Golden Circle, they stormed the Alamo. It wasn't a repeat of the first time, thankfully. The commander handed over, a Georgian actually, handed over the keys and the cannons and the firearms and all of the forts in Texas to the rebels. And they kind of immediately gathered up a whole bunch of soldiers and were like, let's go take New Mexico. So they went over to El Paso and then Fort Bliss. Then they went north along the Rio Grande and they took a fort rather easily from the Federals. Actually, they shouldn't have, but they retreated from the fort in the middle of the night, and it was like July, I think, and so it was hot. And once the sun rose, I mean, these guys were dropping like flies. There's like this story that before the commander, Major Lind, he told everyone to burn everything and pour out the whiskey, but the guys they didn't want to. So a bunch of guys filled their canteen with whiskey, walked across the desert. It was 100 degrees, and they were just collapsing. In a huge victory, the rebels took them all prisoner and took the fort, took their cannons, and it was kind of a big win. And then they just kind of kept going up the Rio Grande. One of the first major battles was at a place called Valverde. It was on the Rio Grande. They kind of skirted this fort called Fort Craig, but I went to last October. It's just ruins now. It's not really anything. But at one time, it was an impressive fortification, and the rebels were like, well, we're not storming that. That's just suicide. So they kind of went around, won the battle, but it was kind of Pyrrhic. They stole a bunch of cannons from the Federals, and then they went up, took Albuquerque, took Santa Fe. Taking Santa Fe was the only Federal held territory or capital that the rebels took in the entire war. And then they kind of were going to take Fort Union, which is near Las Vegas, not that one, but Las Vegas, New Mexico. And on their way, they won yet another battle called Glorieta Pass. It's a beautiful area. It's right off of I-25. There's a huge old Catholic church that was burned during the Pueblo Revolt. It was one of the biggest churches in the New World. And so there's a lot of history in that really cool area. That was the Santa Fe Trail where they fought on. And while the rebels were winning, a detachment of Federals went around the mesa, found all 100 wagons of the rebels, and burned everything they had. So at that point, the campaign was over. They went back to Santa Fe, retreated back to Albuquerque, retreated down the Rio Grande. They skirted in these mountains called the San Mateo Mountains. It's beautiful. I camped there with my dog last October just to check it out. And then it kind of just fell apart and they went back to Texas.
Yeah, I will admit the Southwest is probably the area of the country I've spent the least time in. I mean, out of the Pacific Northwest, right? Just due to geographic proximity. But I have enjoyed a number of books, right, about the Southwest. There's a amazing segment. It's a a minor feature in All the King's Men, right, which is where I take my pseudonym from. And the main character basically finds out a certain piece of information and gets in his car and in one sitting drives from Baton Rouge, Louisiana to Venice Beach, and there are these beautiful descriptions of driving through the desert that I found really captivating. And in looking over your work, right, obviously the topography of that area of the country is, I mean, to say it's difficult to traverse is probably an understatement. So obviously, you have things like the Mormon wagon trains, but to what degree did that topography, did that land affect the history of that region?
I would say it defines the history of the region, essentially. I mean, water is all important and it's rare. So rivers are major thoroughfares. And then outside of the rivers, you've got deserts, and then you've got enormous sky islands, is what they're called sometimes. These mountain ranges. Some of them are isolated, some of them are chains. And say so in the Civil War series, I really, I live here. Actually, I live in New Mexico. I live in a small town in the Sandia Manzano Mountains, and the rebels actually stopped and camped here in like April or March, and it just snowed on them the entire time. And then a month later, they were all dying of thirst, literally. And so the weather, the topography up and down through places called Jornada del Muerto, like the Way of the Dead, essentially. Um, it's that's pretty much where they detonated the first atomic bomb. So you can imagine it's just a horrible, dry, dusty place. But that's just kind of New Mexico. I mean, you go to Arizona and it's harsh. You've got northern Arizona is beautiful high desert, but it's windy. There ain't no water except for like the Colorado or the Little Colorado. Then you got the Mogollon Rim, which is just this cliff that like bisects Arizona. And below that is where you get the saguaros and just the scorching Sonora desert temperature. But in the mountains in the Southwest is gorgeous. It's cool. It snows. We got 8 inches last Saturday, and it's going to be like 75 today. So it's up and down. And I mean, I'm from Georgia, like I said, and I ain't used to snow and this dry air, but I love it. So the topography defines not even just like the Civil War, but the Mexican American War. So I know a little bit about Mormon history because I am Mormon. Um, the Mormons kind of went north, but during the Mexican American War, the longest military march in American like war history was the Mormon Battalion, and they came through Santa Fe and they took it without firing a shot, and then they went down south into Mexico briefly, went up into Arizona, ended up all the way at pretty much, was it Settlers Mill where they discovered gold? Then they walked back to Salt Lake. But I mean, that I want to do a series over that eventually, but I'm going to do the Mexican American War first. But just that march alone through the Great Plains and then the mountains and then the desert and then California, and they went through, I mean, I don't know if you've been to Eastern California, but it is scorching basin and range desert, beautiful, but man, it is a harsh place.
Yeah, I like I said, very limited exposure to that area of the country. When I was a young teenager, my grandfather had just retired, so over one summer, he and I took a great American road trip, all really across the country, and spent the majority of that time, in the Rockies and in the Southwest. So obviously limited exposure. And to me, the defining the defining memories were one, there's hot and then there's hot, right? Southern hot is a very different thing, right? It's humid. It kind of saps your ability to do anything, and it's sort of a redundancy, right? But the dry heat is something very different. And you mentioned the Mexican American War, and I have sort of a soft spot for Mexican history. Like I kind of love Emperor Maximilian. But I'm curious, have you done any coverage on the Pancho Villa expedition? Because that's something that I find particularly fascinating. It's just a chapter in American history.
I have not, but I absolutely have to. I mean, it happened right before World War One, and there are some major players involved in World War One in that expedition. Plus, in college, I took a Mexican history class with my favorite history professor, and I didn't know nothing about Mexican history. I still don't know too much, but I know more than the average person, I guess. And that particular saga was like my favorite part of the story, but also Maximilian as well. And I do talk about Maximilian quite a bit in my Civil War series because the rebels had this hope of linking up with Maximilian and creating this, massive white led empire or dual empire in Mexico and the American Southwest and the American South. It never happened, thanks to the British, but it's exciting to learn about. And yeah, that is a great part of history.
Well, and I love, and this is something that you see in American Southern history just writ large. But the kind of the beautiful tragedy of it all, right? Obviously, Gone with the Wind is kind of a cliche, but even in that, you see the classic elements of a tragedy, right? There is hubris, there is a fall, and then there is in that virtue. And to me, when I look at a man like Emperor Maximilian, you see something similar, right? You refusing to abandon your men, knowing you would be shot, right? You refusing to bow, refusing to basically cuck to the rebels and getting shot for it. I don't know. It's a bit romantic, right? But it's something I certainly have sympathies for.
Oh, it is, and I do too. History is full of men and characters like that, and they are the type of men. They're my favorite type of historical figures to learn and research and kind of read about, and you can sympathize with those historical characters more than say just the Napoleons, which I enjoy Napoleonic history as well. But
Well, I'm curious, and maybe this is a little bit outside the scope of this podcast, but as someone who refuses to plan topics for a podcast, my viewers should be used to it. But I'm curious if you could speak to the historiography of the American West, because from an outside observer, it seems as if in a previous kind of instantiation of American civic religion, the West was a positive expression of American values. Right, there was the classic figure of the frontiersman, which is sort of like the American knight in shining armor. Right, that was the sort of archetype by which Americans measured themselves. And obviously, you see that all the way from Nathaniel Hawthorne up through the kind of Western movies of the 50s and 60s. But after the Cultural Revolution, that was deconstructed, and particularly in any conflict between European settlers and indigenous peoples, speaking in the, the most regime-approved terms possible, right? That is now recast as this kind of, I guess, like rapacious drive for extermination. And look, like when I spoke about Blood Meridian, right, which is fiction, but speaks to a moment in time. I understand that when you have Rossen Creek, right, when you have a war of extermination between two civilizations, things will get nasty. So I'm not trying to go for a revisionist take, right? That every man with a hat and a gun was just a great guy, trying to extend 20th century liberal values. But to what degree do you think that history has been bent towards an ideological end, right? Has been turned into some kind of narrative of guilt?
I think it has entirely been distorted. I did well, first of all, I did an enormous series over what we call the Anasazi, the people who built the great houses in the stone buildings, the 2, 3, 4 story giant houses or warehouses here in the Southwest, especially New Mexico, but also in Arizona. You can get anywhere off Route 6 and go to a nice ruin somewhere. And those people, it's called the Pueblo Mystique. And around the same time, the Cultural Revolution, they were just cast as these peace loving people who just kind of disappeared. But no, they ate each other, they killed each other. And then when it got real bad, they just left. Half of them went to the Rio Grande and are the current Puebloans, the other half went down to Mexico. And so, first of all, the whole history of this area before whites even got here was violence and death and destruction and fire and cannibalism, man corn, as it's called colloquially in the archaeological uh, people, I guess. Archaeologists, that's the term.
Well, and it's one of those things. Look, I've said it before. I'm not a historian. That's not my background. But as a to put a fancy term on a guy who reads books sometimes, as a student of human nature, right? There's this bizarre preconception, and really, I think it derives from Rousseau, right? The idea of the noble savage, and the argument is effectively that man, in and of his essence, is good, and what distorts man is his inability to act freely. It is the constraints society puts upon us that produce uh, different issues, right? And in a state of nature, quote unquote, all of our needs would be met. There would be no need for war or for conflict. And to me, that is a ideological, or one could even say theological claim, right? It's not something that you can empirically prove because it depends on a thought experiment, right? Truly uncivilized man, which is very difficult to find. Like I realize we still have hunter gatherers, but even then, right, there is some semblance of a culture there. And when we look at the primary sources, right, when we look at non traditionally civilized people, right, what our great grandfathers would have called savages, well, they are human, right, and they display the vices and virtues inherent to the human race, but they are far from perfect. And to me, that kind of backwards way of looking at it, which honestly, and you see this in uh, kind of the psychology of child rearing as well, right? The idea of the perfect youth corrupted by social influence, but it just doesn't hold up, and it's a little bit bizarre that the far right opinion is effectively uh, pre-Columbian people are human for good or ill.
Yeah, I don't particularly ascribe to that noble savage theory, just because you read enough books, you write enough words, you talk about it enough, you see that I don't think it's there. And I talked, I think, like 130,000 words about the Apache, and I went into it very trying to be Daryl Cooper, looking at both sides. But after 300 years of the Apache slaughtering the Spanish and then the Mexicans before Americans even got to the West. I mean, the Mexicans weren't and Spaniards weren't very kind either, nor were the Puebloans. But when you've got a people who just they refuse to grow corn, they refuse to do anything except raid. Their only way of living was to go in the mountains, come out of the mountains, raid your village, kill everyone, take the children, raise them as Apache, and then the cycle repeats for 400 years. It got it got difficult for me to see both sides of the, trying to be kind to both sides. And it speaks to these Apaches. They didn't have some outside influence, except, well, they did obviously, but they didn't give into it. So yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, the Apache are. I don't know. I find them personally fascinating, and I've mentioned Blood Meridian. They feature heavily in that. Do you want to? And you mentioned their way of life, but do you want to speak to their significance in the history of the region, specifically as it kind of affects us Americans?
Yeah, I wasn't sure about their impact on the region before researching about them. I just knew they were Apache here. I like going to Ruidoso. It's like I like going to the casino if they got a beautiful area. I didn't know their impact, but it's enormous. The Athabascans, which are Navajo and Apache, they split at some point, but they lost a war in Canada, and they went down the mountains, and they found that there were people living in the Southwest, but it had recently been depopulated. So they took over the depopulated areas, and then they just harassed the populated areas. This was probably anywhere from around like 1100 to 1400. And it shaped the Puebloans here. I mean, they were in all of these scattered settlements at every possible land. And the Apache forced them to come together in these massive settlements. And that didn't change when the Spaniards got here. The Spaniards, they tried to branch out, go into all this arable land that they could. There's not much here. But then the Apache forced them to build these presidios, these walled cities in the desert. And then the Americans got here. And at first, surprisingly, they knew that Americans didn't speak Mexican, is what they called it. And they hated Spaniards and Mexicans more than anything. And so at first they were okay with the white eyes, is what they called Americans. But eventually it's the same story. And the Americans would go into, they weren't really farming. They were, but they were trying to mine. And so they would go to these mining settlements, and then a miner would show up, and the entire mining settlement was wiped out by the Apache. So it forced the Americans to do the same, build forts all over the Southwest. I mean, those forts were primarily built to fight against the Apache, not the Mexicans, not the Puebloans. It was the Apache. And the Apache Wars did not end until the 1890s. It was a 25-year war. And the rebels under Baylor and then Sibley took over southern Arizona and southern New Mexico, called it the Confederate Territory of Arizona. They lost as many men to the Apache as they did to the Federals. I mean, the Apache have had an enormous influence in Arizona and New Mexico, even Texas. Before the Apaches got to the area and really expanded, there was this group of people called the Humanos, and they had an empire essentially from the Grand Canyon to the Rio Grande, all the way to almost to the Gulf of America coast. That's the first time I've ever said that, Gulf of America. And it was massive, up into Kansas. They controlled the plains for the bison, the buffalo. They controlled like the pottery trade. Everyone, they were like the lingua franca, these Humanos. By the time the Spanish were there, the Spanish called them like the Humanos Apache, because it's like, well, if you can't join them, or if you can't beat them, join them. And the Humanos' entire massive empire just got handed over to the Apaches. So the Apaches have one of the largest recent influences on the Southwest. And it's an incredible story, incredibly frustrating story, but
Well, and this is, I feel like, one of the, and maybe you can call this like civilization brain, right? That this is the consequence of playing too many paradox strategy games. But there's this view of every culture as if it is effectively a European styled nation state, right? That you have the president of France, the leader of that, they're a government set up. So when we talk about the Apaches, are we talking about an ethnic group? Are we talking about like a unified political body? Like what does that term mean, I guess, in a political sense?
They might be the most decentralized group that I have researched or read about or even really know about. You've got multiple different type of Apaches. You've got the Lipan, they were more on the plains. You've got the Chiricahua, they were in the desert mountains. And you've got the Tonto Apaches, which are only half Apache really, in far western Arizona. And some of them, they all speak what is it? They're intelligible languages. They can understand each other. But I mean, it's so decentralized. When Geronimo broke out of the San Carlos Reservation, one of the last flings of the Apache Wars, he took a couple other groups with him, and they all fled to New Mexico. They killed everyone they came across, man, woman, children, horrific stories. But eventually, one of the leaders got upset at Geronimo, and he threatened to kill him. And so they had to split up, and they didn't see each other again until the very end of this excursion here. So it was and Geronimo wasn't even a leader. He wasn't even a chief. He was a medicine man, but he had that much sway. And the Apaches are the most decentralized people, and that is what frustrated the Spaniards and then the Mexicans and then the American leaders. I mean, it was constantly, bring me your leader. And it's Cochise like, I'm the leader. I was like, well, no, like of everyone. And he's like, no, I don't control them. They have their own chief. I got nothing to do with them in that mountain range that I can see from here. It's just, there is no president. There is no, great grandfather of DC or whatever. It's every tribe for themselves, every band for themselves.
Well, and that's another thing when we talk about the conquest of the West that made things difficult was it didn't work like conquering territory from, let's just say the Spanish or the French or anyone else, where you'd have a fight, you'd sign terms, and for the most part, everyone on each side was bound to those terms because it was under common authority, right? Obviously, people had individual agency, but generally speaking, right, if the U.S. signs a treaty with another sovereign country, that holds at least for a little bit. But when you have this incredible, I guess, decentralization, it's almost impossible because you may have made terms with one guy and his followers, but as you mentioned, right, the band in that mountain range you can see, well, they weren't there. They're not bound by those terms, and so you can sort of forgive why people got incredibly exasperated and just decided, like, why would we make terms if they're just going to be broken by someone else? And when you combine that with the incredible brutality, of the fighting, I mean, it's it's not exactly a mystery why things got so nasty when it comes to those wars.
That is exactly it. The Spaniards, for hundreds of years, would go out, find a leader, and this leader would sign a treaty, and he would say, all right, we're done raiding, and he would stop raiding. But then the next mountain range over, they're like, they didn't even know about the treaty. They weren't there. They have no idea. They would go raid, and the Mexicans, or the Spaniards, the first thing they would do is go to the people they just made a deal with and slaughter them because they assumed it was them. And so then obviously that treaty's done, and the survivors would then just start raiding again. And the same thing happened when the Americans got here. It was that over and over again. Um, and each band, they had their own, their own. I'm trying to think of the word here. They had their own free will, and so they were not bound by anything that anyone else did ever. Even if a chief signed a treaty, and let's say his son was like, I'm not doing this, he would take his little family and whoever wanted to join him, and he would leave and he would continue. And then the Americans would capture him and be like, you were there when you signed the treaty. He's like, well, that was my dad. That was not me. I don't care. I'll do what I want to do. And yeah, it is. That's why eventually Sonora and Chihuahua gave um, rewards for scalps, as in Blood Meridian. And that was their actual thing.
So I want to fast forward a little bit to the 20th century. Uh, so obviously, well, I'll put it this way. I assume that the population of the American Southwest exploded with the invention of air conditioning, because that's exactly what happened in the Deep South. So when we look at the region now, where are people congregated, right? What kind of typifies that region? Because again, like I said, I don't know very much about it at all.
Yeah. So, um, my wife and I got this beautiful house up in the mountains with a great view. We can see like 100 miles into the desert. It's pretty cool. We don't have air conditioning in our house, but it just doesn't get very hot up here. Most people live around the rivers, the Gila River, the Salt River over in Arizona, Phoenix. And then over here, you've got the Rio Grande, it's Albuquerque. Santa Fe is up in the mountains. Doesn't really, it's close to the Rio Grande, but not on it. So you've got to be near water. Everyone's got to be near water, or there's not going to be a big settlement. And even the places near water, like Phoenix, is growing ridiculously. They they really can't sustain much more growth because of just the water. So it's really water. But I'm sure air conditioning allows people to live comfortably. I know my sister, her family live about 45 minutes or an hour away on the other side of the Rio Grande, on the other side of Albuquerque. And she's in it's just sand and dirt. Or no, not even dirt. It's just sand. And if she didn't have air conditioning, well, she wouldn't be there. So air conditioning is a must. But I'm blessed that we're at 7,000 feet almost, so it's not bad up here. But it's water.
The one other thing, when I think of your region, is the Cold War history. So you mentioned earlier, right, the testing of nuclear bombs. And I, like many others, may or may not have accidentally driven onto White Sands Missile Base, which the government does not look kindly upon.
No,
Now,
no, it does not.
admittedly, right, I think part of the reason we were able to get off completely early or completely easily is that when you have a recently retired man and his 12-year-old grandson very lost in a pickup truck. The MPs were like, all right, just get out of here. But nonetheless, right, there are a lot of military facilities out there. So obviously, Area 51 is the one that hits headlines, but there are others. So what do you have in that area?
We have not everyone, nearly everyone I know works for Sandia Labs. And even the guy that we bought, well, we didn't buy the house from him, but we bought it from his wife, this beautiful house. He died of cancer. Our neighbor is my age. He works at Sandia Labs. I don't want to give too much away, but he has a debilitating disease that has developed because he is working at Sandia Labs. And that's in like Albuquerque. When when we were worried about, I guess, not really worried, but when a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia, Albuquerque's getting hit with 3 atomic bombs. And you wouldn't think it's in the middle of the desert, but this is where they build the bombs, is in Sandia Labs. Then you've got Los Alamos to the west of Santa Fe. That's where they developed or put together the bomb, I think. And they drove down into the desert, into the White Sands, and they detonated it. Um, you can't get away from military bases here. They're just everywhere, or small like units. It'll just be like this closed off area with a satellite, and it's like, oh, I don't know what they're doing there. We live in the corridor. We live pretty close to I-40 and Route 66, and this is a corridor for what I could tell Army helicopters. Once a day, there'll be Black Hawks, Apaches, Chinooks. Every now and then, there'll be some Marine helicopters, but it's like a different area. They have like a different highway, I guess. Um, so we see helicopters every day. They're AC-130s or something similar. A giant uh, aircraft takes off in Albuquerque because the Albuquerque Sunport, the airport, is, I think, the only one in the country, but it is split between civilian and military. That is the Sandia base, Air Force Base, if it's called Sandia. Kirkpatrick, I don't remember. It is they shared the runway. So it's like you could land and then right behind you would be like an enormous Air Force, uh, enormous Air Force jet.
Yeah, and again, it's not my area. I don't know it well, but that's something I definitely remember. That you, you see these, massive military aircraft, and obviously, I think a lot of the UFO movement is, to put it mildly, kind of wacky. But I have been to Roswell, complete tourist trap, by the way. I don't know if you'd be surprised by that.
I love Roswell, but it is that, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of do too. I have a soft spot for Americana, and yeah, that's
Me
about as
too.
about as Americana as you can get. But I mean, there certainly is something, right? Like there's we
There's
only say
something.
we only put out brave statements here, but there appears to be something going on. Uh, you mentioned Route 66, right? Which is obviously a hugely emblematic part of the American story. Admittedly, less relevant now because of the interstate system. But to what degree did that highway kind of change the region?
I think Route 66, tied together with the lifting of the gasoline restrictions after World War II, it was the beginning of the tourist explosion. You've got entire towns that were just a couple shacks. By the early 1950s, were tourist areas. Ruidoso down south, just straight west of Roswell. It was nothing, and by 1950s, it was had a racetrack, casinos. It was huge, but that's just one town. It is every town along Route 66. Once you get past like Tucumcari, which is far eastern New Mexico, I mean they blew up. You've got in Arizona, Winslow and Holbrook, and of course, the Flagstaff, and all these towns that were just escapes from the heat in the mountains. And then now all of a sudden they've got uh, hotels and cabins, and it's a everyone's dream to go there and be in the mountains and enjoy the scenery, which was miserable prior. But yeah, I think the Mother Road had a huge influence. People can get in their cars and just drive out here, and they could see, wow, this is. I mean, imagine being from Baton Rouge and then coming all the way out here where it's green over there and it's red over here, and it's like an alien landscape. And thankfully, my favorite places have not blown up, but they're bound to eventually, unfortunately, unless we can deport 20 million people.
Well, I'm certainly willing to give it a shot.
Me too.
So one of the things that I feel like Europeans miss when they discuss our country, and there are a number of things, right? Uh, One of them obviously is just the sheer scale of it. Like you and I are currently speaking within the same country, and we are conservatively 3 to 4 thousand miles apart, right? Just just kind of guesstimating.
Yep.
Uh, but also to that, right? The American psyche, while certainly built on a European foundation, it is fundamentally different. And I think some of that comes from, and even a rather infamous Austrian painter recognized this fact, that the kind of people who self-selected to go to America, you're pulling from a specific segment of the population. You're adding a ton of, shall we say, selection pressure, right? As we've spoken about the incredibly harsh conditions faced by settlers, the uh, conflicts, I'll put it that way, with the native inhabitants, right? Producing a very certain breed, right? Selecting for that. And one of the things that people are often confused about Americans is our obsession with the personal ownership of arms. So I did a series with George Bagby about the Scotch Irish, right?
It was
And
great.
coming from the borderlands in what was now the United Kingdom, and how those people had in their culture a tradition of you know arms ownership. But when you look to the West, when you look to the frontier, that is even more emphasized, right? Like people don't understand, I mean, even until relatively recently, how unpoliced vast segments of America were. And speaking to my own culture, right, to Appalachia, uh, the this is a difficult topic to talk about, but the strong penchant for, shall we say, community justice, right, to use a progressive term, is very deeply baked in, largely because there just wasn't a lot of, contact with the government. And obviously, the West is synonymous with, the man with his gun, right? So to what degree do you think that that kind of personal ownership of firearms, contributed to the West, and is that tradition still alive?
It is very much alive, despite New Mexico governor trying to ban our firearms. It is very much a part, and I mean, not even just today, but throughout history in the Southwest. The Mexican government outlawed the personal firearms of Mexicans, and that was extremely detrimental when it comes to the Apache for the Mexicans. But a little aside from that, I listened to that series with Bagby, and it got me thinking how different the West would be if 600,000 American men didn't perish in an unfortunate war, and how little, how it would not have been as necessary to have immigration after 1865 if those 600,000 men themselves, Americans, especially Southerners, because that's who goes west, went west instead of infinite, not infinite, a lot of immigrants from Europe. And I think the conquering of the West would have been even more total if it had been primarily Americans with their firearms doing it. But absolutely, communal justice, all you got to do is watch a Western. Um, there was another time right before I started my podcast, I had read this article, just an absolute garbage article, saying the violence in the Southwest, in the West in general, like that we see in movies and dime novels, was just a fabrication. And it wasn't dangerous. That's just a glorification of violence in the West. It didn't happen that way. Within my first series of like researching and reading books, I'm like, well, that's absolutely garbage. The West was incredibly violent against white man versus Indians, white man versus white man versus Mexicans. I mean, what an outlandish statement, but it was incredibly violent. And we would not have been able to secure the West if it were not for firearms. There was General Crook. He was instrumental in the Apache Wars, but before that, he was in California. And he was talking with these, I don't remember the tribe's name, dang it, but he was talking with some river tribe in Northern California. And he sat down the chief and he looks at everyone and he's like, I see your little ones here. And, you may kill 100 of my men, but all I got to do is come back and kill these little ones here and kill your warriors. And you can't replenish those. I have an endless stream of men with guns behind me. We will never stop coming. We're like a wave. We will just, you cannot win. And I think that would not have been possible if it weren't for firearms and communal justice and the things that we think of when we think of the West.
Yeah, and there's something to that, just in the sense of it was not a civilized place, right? You did not have the kind of social institutions you had in, places like, the East Coast, where, they had been settled, in the 17th century, right? Time for that to build up.
I mean, the
And
land itself is not civilized. Like the physical land is violent and uncivilized and almost untamable.
yeah, I mean, you're definitely right. And I, I love the Appalachians, but those mountains are completely different. They're rolling foothills compared to the Rockies, which are these huge, young, just, I mean, cliffs, right, in comparison. And again, right, you also have the other thing, which is, how do you, like, what does agriculture look there, right? It's not something. I mean, I guess you obviously, after the invention of barbed wire, changes, but even then, right, it's not done in the same way in the Midwest or in the East, right, where you have these kind of like neat tracts of tilled land. It's basically open pasture, and obviously I'm dramatically oversimplifying there, but even then, that creates its own kind of cultural difference.
Yeah, if the monsoons are a week late, your corn isn't growing. Or if it stops a week too soon, your corn isn't growing. You've got a whole crop, crop of corn that ain't coming. I mean, that was more for the Indians, but that was early settlers as well. They quickly found out that growing is rather difficult. Um, my father's side of the family is from far western North Carolina, border of Tennessee and Georgia. And I found out just last week that they have been there since 1749. And so I too am half Appalachian. And my mother's from the Louisiana Bayou. She's just a savage.
I will say I have a great deal of affection for the different cultures of America, and I love Louisiana, but it is the true Cajun accent. I think is the only accent in America I just cannot understand. Like it's incomprehensible to me. And there was I was down in Louisiana, visiting a friend, and got into this absolute debacle with a mini horse. Apparently, is very different from a pony, and they're mean as hell. They're super aggressive, and apparently, I had been warned in heavily Cajun accented Louisiana English, English in quotation marks, of
Yeah,
course, not to run through the paddock, and I had just missed it completely. So I got assaulted by a miniature horse for my for my
they're like
for
the
my trouble.
Chihuahua of horses, man.
Yeah, pretty much. So, dude, we are fast coming up on time. This has been a really fun conversation. If people want to find you, want to find your work, maybe you want to check out some of your recipes, what's a good way for them to do that?
TheAmericanSouthwest.com. I don't know how I got lucky enough to score that. But yeah, TheAmericanSouthwest.com. My podcast is The American Southwest. You can find it everywhere. My YouTube channel is, I think, The American Southwest. I actually don't know. So yeah, I'm everywhere. Thomas Wayne Riley. And I will talk for hours, and you can read all my stuff. And I got some good recipes on there.
Yeah, I was eyeing your one of your earlier ones for margaritas. I might have to borrow that one.
Yes.
Again, I'll have all those down in the description. You can check them out. I'll be sure to have you back on again. This was a fun conversation. We can talk about something more structured, a little more history. But I always like to give people an intro before we get into the real hot and heavy stuff. But those will be down in the description. You can find those. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is available anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. You can check out my work also, Radio Free Chicago, which is my paywalled show with Thomas777, or support us at Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching or North Appalachian Supply for all your gear needs. Again, man, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.